All right, let's dive into a really fascinating but often overlooked chapter of history, the Philippine-American War. We're going to be checking out an episode of American History Tellers. It's called The Howling Wilderness. We're
Uh,
going to uncover the events that shaped this conflict, especially looking at General MacArthur's strategies
yeah.
and some of their unexpected consequences.
Yeah, you know what I think is so interesting about this particular episode is how it reveals kind of the intricacies of war. That sometimes even the most calculated victories don't actually lead to the outcomes you might expect.
Yeah, for sure. And it all starts with the pursuit of Emilio Aguinaldo, who was the
Yeah.
leader of the Filipino resistance. Capturing him was a huge priority for the Americans,
Yeah.
both strategically and symbolically. So how did they finally manage to capture him?
Well, the episode details how they captured Aguinaldo's courier, and that was really a crucial turning point. They decrypted the courier's messages, and that's how they got intel on Aguinaldo's location, and that his supplies were actually dwindling. And that's where Colonel Funston enters the picture, with this really audacious plan. I mean, can you imagine using Filipino defectors, disguised as rebels,
Mm.
to infiltrate Aguinaldo's camp?
Yeah, posing as a prisoner himself. I mean, what a risky move. Did General MacArthur even prove this?
Well, initially, MacArthur was skeptical. He actually called it a desperate undertaking. But the potential reward was too big to ignore. I mean, the hope was that capturing Aguinaldo would just completely shatter the Filipino resistance and then quickly bring an end to the war.
But incredibly, it worked.
It did.
Funston's group used Aguinaldo's birthday celebration to their advantage, caught him completely off guard, captured him on March 23rd, 1901.
It's pretty remarkable. But as the episode goes on to show, this was really just the first act in a much more complicated story. Aguinaldo's capture didn't actually have the immediate effect that they hoped for. It didn't lead to the collapse of the resistance that MacArthur had anticipated.
So it was a victory for America. It was a symbolic victory,
Yeah.
but it didn't have the kind of war-ending impact that they were hoping for. How did Aguinaldo react when he was captured?
Well, the episode highlights these really contrasting emotions that Aguinaldo was experiencing at the time. You know, he was treated respectfully by MacArthur, who urged him to accept defeat. But you can tell that he was grappling with all these emotions: anger, distress, and despair. A sense of betrayal, which comes out in his own words.
Yeah, and in a letter to the Filipino people, Aguinaldo ultimately calls for peace and acknowledges U.S. sovereignty. But even his surrender didn't have the ripple effect that MacArthur had really envisioned. Why was that?
Well, it's important to remember that Aguinaldo's influence was mainly concentrated around Manila. Other islands, particularly those farther away, they operated much more independently. And that really reflects the kind of diverse nature of the Filipino resistance.
So even with their leader captured, the fight for many Filipinos just continued, especially in those regions outside of Aguinaldo's immediate sphere of influence. This is fascinating. So how did the Americans adapt to this new situation?
Well, the episode introduces us to figures like Teresa Magbanua. She was a female guerrilla leader on the island of Panay. Her story shows how the resistance continued, even after Aguinaldo surrendered, despite a U.S. blockade causing hardship and some guerrilla forces surrendering. She and many others persisted in their fight for freedom.
So the war wasn't simply a matter of capturing one key leader. It was a struggle playing out across numerous islands, each with its own dynamics and motivations. This complexity is fascinating.
It is, and it really underscores why Aguinaldo's surrender, while symbolically significant, didn't actually extinguish the flames of resistance. You could even argue that it set the stage for an even darker chapter in the Philippine-American War.
So that brings us to the question, what happened next? How did this conflict evolve in the face of this continued resistance?
Well, American commanders found themselves grappling with a new set of challenges. They had to adapt to guerrilla warfare in unfamiliar terrain while managing overcrowded refugee camps.
Yeah.
And trying to maintain order, it was a logistical and strategic nightmare.
Oh, wow. Given all of that, how did the Americans respond? Did they reassess their strategy?
Well, instead of reassessing, General MacArthur started justifying harsher tactics. He argued that Filipino guerrilla fighters, by blending in with civilians and not wearing uniforms, they were violating the rules of war that were outlined in General Orders 100.
And just to clarify for our listeners, General Orders 100, that was a policy that actually originated from the Civil War era, aimed at ensuring humane treatment of civilians and prisoners of war, placing limitations on the use of force against non-combatants. So how did MacArthur use this to justify a more aggressive approach?
Well, he claimed that the Filipino guerrilla tactics put them outside the bounds of those rules, and that civilians aiding the guerrillas made themselves targets as well. And that interpretation opened the door to a really dangerous escalation of violence.
And what were the consequences of this shift in policy?
Tragically, it led to a surge in brutality, burning villages, destroying crops, killing livestock. These acts became more and more commonplace. Even more disturbing was the rise of torture techniques, like the water cure.
What exactly was the water cure?
Well, it was a horrific torture method used to extract information or confessions. Victims were forced to ingest large amounts of water until they felt like they were drowning. It caused unimaginable suffering.
That's just horrifying. Were these brutal tactics widespread, and was there any pushback?
Well, the episodes suggest that these tactics unfortunately became more and more widespread, partly because of the frustration and pressure that American forces were facing, while there was some pushback, especially when accounts of these atrocities reached newspapers in the U.S. The situation kept getting worse. In fact, these actions would have a huge impact on the trajectory of the war, contributing to events like the Balangiga Massacre.
The Balangiga Massacre. That was such a pivotal moment in the war. Can you remind us what happened there?
Yeah, so on September 28th, 1901, Filipino fighters on the island of Samar, they orchestrated this surprise attack. They killed almost 50 American soldiers, and they captured a significant amount of ammunition. It was a devastating defeat for the U.S. and a major morale boost for the Filipino resistance.
And this is what triggered a really brutal retaliation from the Americans, right?
Absolutely. Leading the retaliatory campaign was General Jacob Smith. Known for his ruthless tactics, he actually earned the nickname Hell Roaring Jake for a reason. His orders were very simple: kill and burn.
Kill and burn. That's incredibly disturbing.
It was. An American journalist at the time described it as a campaign of extermination and destruction. And those words would soon reach newspapers back home.
So this wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a very deliberate and widespread campaign of brutality.
Yeah.
How did this impact the perception of the war back in the U.S.?
It generated outrage and calls for accountability. And it's important to keep in mind, all of this is happening shortly after Theodore Roosevelt becomes president, following McKinley's assassination. So he inherits this war that's spiraling out of control, and there was this mounting pressure to address these horrifying reports that were emerging from the Philippines.
So how did Roosevelt respond to this pressure? Did he try to downplay the situation, or did he take decisive action?
Well, initially, he really focused on damage control, trying to portray these atrocities as isolated incidents. Rather than a reflection of the broader war effort, he was trying to appease public anger by identifying and punishing what he called the worst offenders.
But could he really contain the fallout, given how serious this all was?
Well, that becomes the central question. As we delve deeper into the events that unfolded, the episode focuses on the court-martial of Major Littleton Waller, who was accused of executing Filipino porters without trial.
And during this trial,
Yeah.
even more disturbing details about these atrocities came to light, right?
Exactly. Yeah, so we're talking about a situation where a major is on trial for executing prisoners. He's claiming he was just following orders from his commanding officer.
So what happened with Waller's trial?
Well, Waller was actually acquitted by a sympathetic panel.
Wow, that's shocking. So the major who admitted to ordering executions was found not guilty.
Yeah, it does raise a lot of questions about accountability and whether military tribunals were truly capable of delivering impartial justice, especially in the context of a war as controversial as this one.
So did the accusations against Waller just disappear with his acquittal?
While his testimony didn't go unnoticed, it shifted the spotlight onto General Smith, who then faced his own court-martial for his role in the Samar campaign.
It sounds like Smith was caught between a rock and a hard place. What happened during his court-martial?
Well, during the trial, Smith actually admitted to making Samar a howling wilderness, but his defense relied on claiming that his harsh orders were necessary to quell the insurgency and protect American troops. He basically claimed that his kill and burn order was a figure of speech, not meant to be taken literally.
So he admitted to the devastating consequences of his actions, but claimed they were justified by the circumstances. What was the verdict?
Incredibly, Smith was only convicted of improvident language, not for the atrocities themselves.
Wait, he's convicted for his words, but not for the actions those words led to. That seems like a really strange outcome.
It does. It highlights the complexities of military justice and the challenges of holding high-ranking officers accountable for actions taken during wartime. It also raises questions about whether the punishment truly fit the crime.
So, with Waller acquitted and Smith receiving a relatively light sentence, what message did these outcomes send?
Well, these verdicts, along with the ongoing attempts to downplay the atrocities, really fueled a growing sense of injustice and anger among Filipinos. It also raised concerns among Americans back home, who questioned whether the U.S. was truly upholding its ideals. of justice and human rights.
How did Roosevelt navigate this increasingly complex and controversial situation?
Well, the episode shows how Roosevelt attempted to control the narrative surrounding the war. Despite all this mounting evidence of atrocities, he used his Memorial Day speech to downplay the severity of the situation and defend American conduct.
What kind of arguments did he use to defend American actions in the Philippines?
He minimized the incidents of brutality, claiming they were isolated occurrences, not representative of the overall war effort. He even went as far as to claim that American warfare was conducted with singular humanity.
That seems pretty hard to believe. Given what we know about the events in Samar and the testimonies that came out during the court-martials, was anyone challenging Roosevelt's version of events?
There was definitely pushback, an ongoing debate in Congress, with some lawmakers demanding further investigation and accountability. However, hearings on Philippine atrocities were eventually closed without a formal report, which allowed the administration to control the narrative.
So despite all the evidence and the outcry, the official narrative remained largely unchallenged.
That's kind of the impression the episode gives. It really highlights the power of political maneuvering and the ability of those in power to shape public perception, even in the face of contradicting evidence.
So what happened next? Did the war just kind of fade away with no clear resolution?
Well, on July 4th, 1902, Roosevelt officially declared the war over, claiming victory for the U.S. It was a symbolic move, of course, aligning with America's Independence Day, but the reality on the ground was much more complicated.
So officially the war was over. But had a conflict truly ended?
Well, major fighting had ceased. But the situation in the Philippines remained tense. The legacy of violence and resentment lingered. The war's impact on the Philippines was truly devastating, leaving behind physical and emotional scars that would take generations to heal.
The episode does a really good job of exploring this complex and often overlooked chapter of history. What are some key takeaways for our listeners?
I think one of the most important takeaways is that history is rarely simple or straightforward. The Philippine-American War, like so many conflicts, is a story of competing narratives, conflicting motivations, and unintended consequences. It really challenges us to look beyond simplistic explanations and grapple with the complexities of war and its impact on both the victors and the vanquished.
We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, from that daring capture of Aguinaldo to the brutal realities of the Samar campaign and the attempts to control the narrative. This story is full of twists and turns.
It is. It also raises some really profound questions about accountability, the justifications for violence, and the long-lasting effects of colonialism. These are questions that I think continue to resonate today as we grapple with similar challenges on a global scale.
What stands out to you as kind of the most significant aspect of this whole story?
You know, for me, it's the resilience of the Filipino people. Despite facing these overwhelming odds, they fought for their freedom and independence. Even after Aguinaldo surrendered, the resistance continued, demonstrating just how deep their commitment to self-determination was.
Their story is a real testament to the power of human resilience and that enduring desire for freedom.
Absolutely. And it reminds us that history isn't just a collection of dates and events. It's a story about people, their struggles, their triumphs, and their enduring quest for a better future.
This has been a fascinating and thought-provoking deep dive into the Philippine-American War. What are some final thoughts you want to leave our listeners with?
Well, I think it's important to remember that the Philippine-American War, despite its significance, is often overlooked in American history. And by understanding this conflict, I think we gain a much deeper understanding of the complexities of American foreign policy and the enduring legacies of colonialism.
It's crucial to examine these often forgotten chapters of history to gain a more complete and nuanced understanding of the past and its impact on the present. It's striking how the Philippine-American War, despite its huge impact, remains relatively unknown to a lot of Americans. Why do you think that is?
Well, it's a complex issue. The Philippine-American War doesn't really fit neatly into the kind of traditional narratives of American exceptionalism that are often taught in schools. It challenges those narratives and forces us to confront some uncomfortable truths about America's role in the world. And it's perhaps easier to overlook or even downplay those aspects of our history.
You're right. It's a story that really disrupts those simplistic notions of good versus evil, victor versus vanquished. The lines are much blurrier, the motivations are more complex, and the consequences are far more reaching.
Exactly. And that complexity might make it harder to teach or even just discuss. It also reflects this broader trend of neglecting or minimizing the histories of colonized peoples. Their stories, their struggles, their perspectives are often marginalized or erased.
And in this case, The Filipino perspective is so essential to understanding the full scope of the war. We heard about Teresa Magbanua and her continued resistance. Are there any other stories or figures from that period that you think, our listeners should know about?
Oh, absolutely. The episode really only scratches the surface. There are so many stories of ordinary Filipinos
Right.
who resisted American occupation. People like Macario Sakay, who continued to fight for independence after the official end of the war. He formed a republic in the mountains of Luzon. His story really highlights that ongoing struggle for self-determination and all the different forms that resistance can take.
Yeah, his story really reminds us that even after a war officially ends, the fight for freedom and justice often continues. What about the impact on Filipino culture and society? How did the war reshape the Philippines?
The war had a devastating impact. It led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Filipinos, destroyed infrastructure, disrupted traditional ways of life, but it also fostered this sense of national identity and solidified their desire for independence. The war became a defining moment in Filipino history, shaping their political and social landscape for generations to come.
It's a powerful reminder that war leaves these scars that run much deeper than physical destruction. It impacts culture, identity, the collective memory of a nation.
Exactly. And those impacts that can be felt for decades, even centuries. The Philippine-American War may be a distant memory for some, but its echoes continue to reverberate in the Philippines and in the relationship between the two countries.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are some key takeaways or lessons we can learn from the Philippine-American War?
I think one important lesson is the importance of critical thinking and challenging those official narratives. It's crucial to question those stories we're told, to seek out different perspectives, and to be aware of the biases that can shape our understanding of history.
Especially when it comes to stories of war and conflict, where propaganda and misinformation can so easily distort the truth.
Absolutely. The Philippine-American War is a perfect example of how easily historical narratives can be manipulated to serve political agendas. It's a reminder that history is always contested and that we should approach it with a critical eye.
You know, this deep dive has been such a powerful reminder that history isn't just this collection of facts and figures. It's a tapestry woven with human stories, struggles, triumphs, and tragedies.
It really is. It's also a reminder that the past is never truly past. It shapes our present and informs our future. By understanding the complexities of the Philippine-American War, we can gain valuable insights into the dynamics of power, the consequences of colonialism, and that enduring quest for freedom and self-determination.
So to our listeners, I encourage you to explore further. Read the works of Filipino historians. Delve into primary source materials. Engage with those diverse perspectives that really enrich our understanding of this complex and often overlooked chapter of history. It's a journey worth taking.
It is. And by engaging with these stories, I think we can honor the memories of those who fought and suffered and learn from the past to build a more just and equitable future.
The Philippine-American War. It serves as this stark reminder of the human cost of conflict and that enduring struggle for freedom and self-determination. It challenges us to confront uncomfortable truths, to question those established narratives, and to engage with history in a way that promotes understanding and empathy.